There was a very famous boxing match one time between Muhammad Ali and Sonny Liston that lasted about 15 seconds. It was a return bout, and Muhammad Ali knocked him out in about 15 seconds. While the crowd was still coming in and taking their seats, people had paid hundreds of dollars to get in to see this fight, and a whole bunch of them never even saw it. Now, the scripture reading this morning is a little bit like that. I've picked out a very short, there's one phrase in it, and I've chosen it specifically because its core is germane to what I want to talk about in the homily this morning. So while Kathleen is getting into her position, Marilyn, be listening to the reading. Are you going to miss it? Good morning, Kate.
Good morning.
You're looking well?
I'm glad to be here.
It's good to have you.
Marilyn is a very good driver.
Oh, good. Good. So here goes, guys. It's from the second letter of Peter. But do not ignore this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord, one day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like one day. Word inspired by God. Okay, good. So every Sunday evening, when I leave here, I drive up home to Healdsburg, and depending on the traffic, it's about a 2.5 to 3 hour journey. And then every Thursday night, I come back down here. And again, depending on traffic, it's either 2.5 or 3 hour safari to get back down here. And so to while away these 6 hours, I download a whole bunch of podcasts, and I try to educate myself on a whole bunch of topics, whether it's geology or psychology or spirituality or physics or whatever. And so I'm listening to these podcasts regularly. And when I come across a great idea, something that really startles me, I'll turn it off. And I may spend the next 10 minutes trying to figure out what did the person mean, or where can I go with this piece of information, or what do I think about it. So I find it really, really, really stimulating. So coming down last Thursday evening, I was listening to a podcast of this brilliant woman. She's a philosophical scientist, or her forte is the science of philosophy and the philosophy of science. She has a master's degree in physics, and she has a PhD in philosophy. And basically, she was trying to reconcile the subjective world of the mind with the objective world of physics and science in particular. And I found it really, really fascinating. And at the end of the podcast, I began thinking, it raised the question for me, do we live in a predetermined cosmos, or do we actually create reality by the free choices that we make? And that's what I want to address in the homily this morning. And I'm going to make 4 main points this morning. The first one I will call Calvin, quantum mechanics, and the preconception contract. Secondly, I'll ask myself, do I have free will? Thirdly, how much time do I have? And then fourthly, so what is reality? So the other 4 points I'll cover this morning. So the first one, Calvin, quantum mechanics, and the preconception contract. Those of you who've ever studied, church history know that of all the people who claimed to have been followers of the carpenter from Nazareth and who claimed to be able to preach on his behalf, there are a few dudes who are sicker than John Calvin. He was a French attorney that moved to Switzerland and plied his trade in Switzerland. And he was famous for his theory of predestination. But typically we think that predestination is this sick system whereby God has predestined some souls to join him in heaven, and then the rest of us are just lost by default. So he picks out some guys, and they're predestined to get to heaven, and the rest of us are just lost in the shuffle. But that wasn't Calvin's theory. Calvin had a 2-pronged version of predestination. So according to Calvin, God created some souls with the intention of bringing them to heaven, and he created other souls with the intention of sending them to hell. Now, how sick a dude is that? So why didn't he just leave them in their non-being? To create them in order to people, that was his belief system, to people hell. So some people then, if you were among the chosen, it didn't matter a damn what you did. You were going to get into heaven anyway. And if you were part of the damned, it didn't matter how good you were, how compassionate, how loving, you were destined to go to hell anyway. So in that model, obviously, there is no such thing as free will. There are no choice. No matter what you do, you're already pre-selected for a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Now, quantum mechanics is a very different theory. There's a brilliant guy called Hugh Everett III who came up with the theory of multiple universes. He was a protege of one of the greatest American physicists of all time, John Wheeler. And the theory was proved very, very unpopular when it was first mooted. In fact, he left the field of physics completely. Hugh Everett III left it. He was so disappointed. But the theory basically says that there are a multiplicity of universes. In fact, according to quantum mechanical theory, there are 10 to the power of 27 brand new universes created every second for every cubic centimeter of 11-dimensional mathematical space. It's a lot of universes. Now, a lot of them are mathematical duds. They fizzle out really, really quickly. But even if the tiniest percentage of them survive, it means there are more than enough universes to accommodate all the combinations and permutations of choices that all human beings who ever lived can possibly make. So there's a universe out there for you to accommodate any bunch or any combination of trajectories that you want to envisage. So that's obviously a model in where there's complete free will. You make all the choices you want to make and then live them through. Now, you've heard me speak many times about a notion I have, which I call the preconception contract. I'm convinced that souls tend to incarnate in soul pods from lifetime to lifetime, where, like a Shakespearean troupe visiting different cities, putting on different plays in a sense. But when we come in together, we have a contract with this group of souls. And we choose a particular physical body that will best suit the purposes of this particular incarnation, depending on what our chosen mission is, what it is that we want to develop as individuals. So we choose the era of human history we want to come in. We choose the physical body. We choose the parents and the siblings and the different others who are going to be part of our lives. We choose the era and we choose the culture that we come into. We choose our relationships as well. And we choose an exit strategy. There's a way in which we will know that this incarnation will end, whether it's through a sickness or illness or whatever. That's pre-programmed in a sense. Apart from that, all bets are off. There's no plot, there's no script, and there's no predetermined dialogue. So all the souls have to figure out, as they interact with each other, how to make this work. So it is not predestination in any sense of the word. It's just that you agreed to play a particular character, you're assigned a gender, you're assigned a particular group of relationships, and you get on with it, you create the dialogue yourself, and the plot emerges from the interactions of all the people. So that's a model, again, in which there's a lot of free will. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point then is, I want to address specifically, do we have free will? So do we actually live in a universe in which we're just, choosing among pre-selected possibilities? A little bit like the political system. We don't have elections in this country or in any country that I've ever lived in. We can choose among pre-selected candidates. We have a term for this in my language. In Gaelic we call it rawa idracha chawar dawl, a choice between two blind goats. So basically, no matter what you do, you'll choose either a Democrat or a Republican. There's nobody else who's going to get elected in this country. And so it's not, is that the kind of universe we live in where there are pre-selected outcomes and you just get to choose between the pre-selected outcomes? Because if that's true, we don't have free will. We got a choice between two blind goats. So is that the kind of universe we live in? Or do we actually create the universe based on the choices that we make? So have we that level of freedom? So I'm going to use a few metaphors just to illustrate my own thinking and my own position in it. There is a part of mathematics which is called game theory, and you see it actually work out through games on computers. So if you take a very great game like Thrones or something like that, it takes up a lot of space, a lot of programming space, a lot of gigabytes are devoted to it. So very often in these games, there's not pre-planned outcomes for all the possible choices you make, because that takes far too much gigabytes from the machine. So what they do is they figure out what are the typical responses and options that people will choose, and they program outcomes for those. If you happen to choose an outcome which is very, very unusual, then the machine has to scramble and create outcomes for that choice you've just made. But they don't want to waste a whole bunch of space by having outcomes which are very unlikely to be chosen. So game theory operates on that principle. You save a whole lot of space by not creating outcomes for every possible option, but only for the likely options. And then if some unlikely option is chosen, you have to kind of scramble to create outcomes for that. Now, so is that free will then? In a sense that there's the normal choices we make, and then if you make very extraordinary choices, somebody up there has to scramble in order to create possible outcomes for it. So that's one metaphor I want to use. A second metaphor would be a chess game. So a chessboard has 64 locations. It has 32 pieces, And each of the pieces has a number of ways that it can move. The pawn can basically just move 1 or 2 steps forward, or it can kill an opponent by going kind of diagonally one way or the other. So it has only 4 possible moves available to it. A castle has about 14. It can go in a straight line the length of the board, straight up or straight across. The knight has basically 8 possible positions. It can do L shapes. It can go 2 to the left and 1 forward, or 1 to the left and 2 forward, or the same thing to the right, same things backwards. So it basically has about 8 options open to it. The bishop has 14 options as well. It can go diagonally the length of the board, diagonally. The king only has 8 options. He can go 1 space, in any direction. And the queen has about 28 options open to her. She can go the length of the board on diagonals or straight lines. So from those very, very limited number of options and the limited number of pieces, you could program a computer and it will show you that there are literally billions of possible trajectories that a game of chess can take. From those very, very simple parameters. 64 locations, 32 pieces, very, very limited options that each piece can make. You can create literally billions of possible trajectories. But when you actually play a game of chess, you're only going to follow one of those possible trajectories, only one of them. Of the billions of possible trajectories that the game could take, it's only going to take 1 trajectory. Now, does that mean then that you're not free? Because you're choosing among billions of possible trajectories. So are you only free when you have unlimited choices? Or you can operate within a system where there are a lot of choices, but it's still limited. So have you got free will in that instance? Now extrapolate that to life. And we live on a chessboard in which there are literally billions of locations, not just 64 locations, and there are billions of pieces on the board. There are 7 billion human pieces on the board, and then there are rocks, there are plants, there are animals, there are mammals, there are human beings, there are avatars, angelic beings or whatever, and many of these have many different abilities. Like, for instance, rocks have the ability to respond to environmental conditions, whether it be sunshine or rain or wind. So even a rock has chemical options open to it, that it responds to its environment. That's the moves that a rock can make. Plants can make many more moves than that. Plants can operate through photosynthesis and download energy from the sun. They can draw nutrients from the soil. They can wave in the wind. They can seduce pollinators in order to cross-fertilize with other plants. So there are much more abilities available to a plant life. You take an animal then, and an animal has the ability to move about and to eat and to mate and self-replicate, defend itself and defend its territory. When mammals come in the equation, mammals are another piece, they have the ability to have compassion. They have the ability to emote, to raise their young, and to dream. So they've got a whole bunch of abilities that plants don't have. And then human beings add to that equation the element of free will, that they can make choices. So now you've got a huge chessboard, literally with gazillions of locations and billions of players with many different abilities. And there's this supercomputer we call God, who knows exactly how many possible trajectories all of these beings with all of these abilities can actually evidence. So the fact that God knows all the possible outcomes and all the possible trajectories, does that mean that we're not free? Because in any one incarnation, every one of us is just going to follow one single trajectory. We're going to make a bunch of choices that lead us in a particular direction. So does that mean that we're not free? Because we're just choosing among possible, trajectories that God knows. Obviously not. We're free to do that. Now, if you build quantum mechanics into it, can we then create parallel universes in which we get to act out all the possible configurations and permutations of all the choices we want to make? But so it's possible that we're living simultaneous incarnations in which we're following through the choices. When we have a choice between A and B, we choose both, and we spin off a parallel universe, which is the result of having chosen A, and one which is the result of having chosen B. And then in B, we have a choice between C and D, and we spin off 2 more universes to accommodate the choices of C and D. So are we free? Is that free will then for us? Which brings me to the third question. Time folds into this then. So time is this really necessary but very limiting human invention. Time is a human invention. It really does not exist. And it's necessary because our little laptops that we carry between our ears are so limited that we can't possibly, grok the entire gestalt And so we have to break it up into bite-sized pieces and process it sequentially. So we live, for instance, in a universe in which 90% of what's out there is either dark energy or dark matter. We can't say anything about it. As human beings, we can only grok about 1/70 trillionth of the electromagnetic spectrum. And we're creating our models of reality from this tiny slice. And time is one of the things we have to employ. Now, time is an illusion, very obviously. We just demonstrate it to you with another kind of a metaphor. I want you to see if you can remember the longest book you ever read. The book with the most number of pages. Maybe something like War and Peace or Joyce's Ulysses or something like that. You know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. And it's going to take you maybe months to work your way through it page by page or paragraph by paragraph. Or if you're reading Joyce, literally word, by teasing word to work your way through it. But the truth is, the minute you picked up the book, everything you're going to read over the next 3 months was already contained between the covers. It's already there. And so it's because of the limitation of your mind that you had to create time in order to process it sequentially. But everything that you're going to read over the next 3 months is already locked between the books. But it's going to take you 3 months to read it. Now, if you were to download that from Amazon.com onto your iPad or your Kindle, within 20 seconds it would download the whole thing for you. 800 pages of War and Peace, download it in 20 seconds. So obviously time isn't fixed. What took you 3 months to grok and to process, the machine can download in 20 seconds. And if you want to find out, for instance, you want to do a check and find out how many times does the word roses appear in War and Peace, you just plug in the word roses and do a check, and within 10 seconds, the machine will tell you it appears 82 times, and the first time is on page 17, and the next time is on page 35, and it'll tell you exactly where they are. So this is a machine that can process this much, much more quickly. So that tells us that time is an illusion. It's something the human mind has to make up because of the smallness of the brain. And so in actual fact, when we travel at the speed of light, time goes to zero. So if you're aboard a craft and you're traveling in space literally at the speed of light, and you pass a clock somewhere out in space, and you look at the clock as you're passing, and the clock says 3 minutes after 12, and you're rushing off into space, and you're looking back, the light from the clock face is traveling at the same speed that you're traveling at. So it's always going to say 3 minutes after 12. No matter how far out you go, and you look back and you can see the clock face, it's always going to say 3 minutes after 12. And so time has stopped once you travel at the speed of light itself. Now, if we are indeed light, if we are light bodies, it means there's the possibility of entering that level of the self where time is no more. Now, it's a true fact, for instance, that you have about 70 trillion cells in your body. Every one of these cells has about 10 to the power of 14 photons of light attached to it, which is about, so we're talking about maybe 10 to the power of 28 photons of light within a human body. If you could release the light in one human body, you could light up a baseball stadium at 1 million watts for 3.5 hours. So we're basically light beings. So what happens when you access your light body? There is no time anymore. You're living in timelessness. And so time is an illusion, a very necessary illusion created by human beings because of the tiny capacity of our little brain. Which brings me to my fourth point then. So what then is reality? How do we grok reality? So again, quantum mechanical theory tells us, in some senses, that observation collapses the wave of all possibilities down to a particular kind of an outcome. And one of the most fascinating illustrations of that for me was a podcast I was listening to several years ago by a guy called Brian Swim, a cosmologist, great character. And he made this one statement, and it rocked me. I turned off the radio in order to process this. And what he said was, he said, 1 billion years ago, there was no color on planet Earth. I said, are you joking me? I turned it off. He says, you tell me 1 billion years ago, the sky wasn't blue, and daffodils weren't yellow, and grass wasn't green? I put it back on again, and he says, 1 billion years ago, there was no color on planet Earth, because 1 billion years ago, the eye had not yet been invented. The eye was invented by a tiny little creature called the trilobite 545 million years ago. So 1 billion years ago, there was no eye on planet Earth. So there was nothing to infer color from nature. And in the absence of an appropriate witnessing consciousness, nature is not free to reveal particular aspects of itself. So in that sense, in that one sense then, we are creating reality in some sense of the word. So are we creating reality or just we're inviting nature to portray particular aspects of itself, of the vast repertoire of possibilities to portray particular ones. But in the absence of the appropriate witnessing consciousness, nature cannot reveal particular aspects of itself. Whether that nature, we're talking about physical reality, or about interdimensional reality, or about source or God, or whatever. So the problem with us humans is, as I said, we can only literally, our sensorium can only grok 1/70 trillionth of the electromagnetic spectrum. And so what happens is, whatever's out there, and we can say nothing about whatever's out there. There's a theory in philosophy called the myth of the given, which is the belief system that our sensorium delivers us one-to-one mappings of reality. We can't say that. All we can say is, given the particular senses we have and the range of the senses we have, here's what gets represented inside our cranium. So what happens is basically is, whatever is out there, it sends data to the human sensorium. The sensorium takes like photographs of it. And then we foist interpretations on the data that come into the cranium. And we call this perception. Perception is very different from what our senses deliver to us. Perception is what the brain does with the data it receives through the senses. And it may or may not correspond with what you're seeing or even what's out there. And so the next stage, the first one is data, the second one is sensorium, and the third is perception. Then it's our perceptions that create our experiences. And then we archive our experiences in memory. And the whole bunch of these memories create our notion of reality. So that's how it happens on an individual level. Now, culture gets into the equation as well, and culture pre-programs us, and it shuts down particular abilities to perceive in particular ways. So it is very, very difficult to see that which the culture tells us does not exist. And so if you live in a materialistic culture that tells you that nothing is real except that which can be sensed, then you're shut down. Your model of reality is very, very closed down. And very, very often, you can only see the reality that your culture allows you to see. And so prejudices of all kinds, racism of all kinds, are built because cultures have closed down our ability to see beyond the boundaries. So we don't actually see what is there. We don't see things as they are, we see things as we are, or we see things as the culture tells us is true. So you put all these pieces together then, and the conclusion I come to is this, that the only truly free person actually only has one choice. There's the paradox. We think that we would only be free if we could choose among unlimited possibilities. And so the very fact that there is a huge number of possibilities, but still a limited number of possibilities, does that mean that we're not able to exercise free will? Not at all. We don't have to be in an unlimited number to be truly free. So for instance, Patricia Burrell gave me a jar of jam a few weeks ago, and I brought back the jar this morning. I'm not good enough as a yogi to make a pretzel of myself and fold myself into that jam jar. I couldn't do it, no matter how hard I tried. So does that mean I'm not a free being? I don't have free will, because I can't climb inside Patricia Burrell's jam jar. There's ridiculous kinds of notions, obviously. So I don't have to have an unlimited number of possibilities in order to be able to exercise free will. The truth is, I actually only need one possibility to be truly free. And there's a big difference theologically between free will and freedom. Free will is the ability to do as I please. Freedom is the ability to do as pleases God. And so the only truly free person is the person who always chooses the loving response to life. So the paradox is this, that the exercise of free will is exercised only in the presence of a single choice, not in a multiplicity of possibilities, but only with a single possibility. The possibility that you are fully awake and unconditionally loving is the guarantee that you're a free person exercising free will outside of time. All right, guys, shoot.
I got a question.
Georgie.
What did you just say?
I said, hi, Georgie. Come on, George. Tell us a joke or something. No, don't. Okay. Jenny.
Well, I would contend simple words,
Okay.
but harder than to do.
Okay.
And so, we have the 10 Commandments, and we have teachers, and we have higher level beings. But then, in the end, in any given moment, how do you stay on course?
Okay, totally, absolutely. On any given moment, how do you stay on course? So all of these great teachers and all of these great systems like the Ten Commandments, they're all efforts to, firstly, to wake us up. And when you become fully awake, there is only one option open to you, and that is to love. And so the most important virtue of all is not loving, it is being awake. Because what passes for love very often, if I'm not awake and I think I'm loving, is just mawkish sentimentality or emotionality. So the object of the exercise, of all these exercises and all these great avatars, is to wake people up. Which is why, Gautama Siddhartha will give himself the nickname the Buddha, the one who is awake. Or Jesus Christ will talk constantly about if the householder knew at what stage the thief was going to break in and steal, he would stay awake. So the greatest orienting principle of all is to ask myself in any one moment, how awake am I now? In whatever choice I'm going to make, whatever I'm going to say, whatever I'm going to do, how awake am I? And how much have I just been acting on pre-programmed impulses from my own unconscious or from societal injunction? Yeah.
But then doesn't... Okay, sorry.
Was there a follow-on? Was there a follow-on comment?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, yeah, it was.
Okay.
But then to be awake and to not be, it's sort of like, as a psychologist, you must work and see this all the time. To be able, when a thought arises or an event happens, at least what I find for me, is my mind commandeers the situation, sometimes without a gap, so I don't even see that I've been doing the same thing for the past, 55 years, over and over again to the stimulus. And so breaking those patterns requires in some ways either that Buddhist self-reflection going inward or working with someone outside of you so that doesn't happen, right?
And that is the meaning of the great law of karma. Karma is not a punitive mechanism whereby we are punished in subsequent incarnations for sins we committed in previous incarnations. Karma is the ultimate law of science. It's the law of cause and effect. I do A and B happens. Do I like B? Great, keep doing A. I don't like B, stop doing A. And so really, just watching the consequences of the choices I'm making immediately gives me feedback as to whether or not, I'm doing what's good or what's bad. The essence of learning or education is twofold, in my opinion. It is repetition and it is feedback. For instance, if that clock that's on the wall there, if that were, a dartboard, and you and I are playing darts, and we stand here and we're throwing darts and trying to create a bullseye, and somewhere through it, I hang a sheet across on the wall, and we have to throw the darts over the sheet onto the dartboard, which we can't see. So we have no idea where the darts are landing. I can't improve my aim. I have no idea where they're landing, therefore I can't improve my shot. And so feedback and repetition is the essence of growth, learning, and evolution. And that's the law of karma. You do something, you watch what the results are, you like the results, keep doing what you were doing. If you don't like the results, do it differently. Yeah. So Karen was first and then Johanna.
So it would seem to me that a person can't be really awake if they have attachments to anything.
Okay.
So for me, it feels like the first step is trying to establish the gap between the action and your assessment of the action, so that you start. For me, that's kind of where time starts to expand. That there's a place in which I can actually, things kind of stop, and I can actually see the choices ahead of me and my reactions to those things and the patterns that I have, and it gives me an opportunity to not do those things. And I don't know, how, I don't know if it's the silence that helps you find the gap, but it feels really tangible to me that it's a real thing where things just seem to kind of stop. And so if there's, once there's no attachment and a person is actually awake, then I'm not sure there's even really choosing. It's more like it's just the way you are, not necessarily that you're making a choice.
So it's a great statement that, in the presence of attachment, there's no real, awakening. You're absolutely right. But there are intermediary stages. And so the image that comes to mind is, if you watch a little kind of a toddler who's crawling around after his mother, and the mother is walking between the kitchen and the sitting room and the dining room, whatever, and the little toddler is crawling around after her, and then he's exploring some nooks and crannies. As long as the toddler can look back and see his mother, he'll continue to explore. But if this toddler gets to a place where he looks back and he can't see his mother, he's going to freak out. And if that happens regularly, that he gets himself into positions where he can't look back and find his home base, mother, he'll stop exploring. And that's the same with the spiritual journey as well. Where none of us are fully evolved beings. We all need temporary home bases, and the home base is mother. And the home base can move. Mother can move from the kitchen to the dining room to the sitting room, whatever, and as long as I can keep her inside, I have an operating base to explore from. So our waking up process is a sequential system of changing our home bases, making more evolved home bases with wider perspectives. Because the key to all evolution is the ability to move from narrower perspectives to wider perspectives. So by moving our home base, that's what we achieve. So the waking up process, not a once and for all, we're fully there. It's a question. It's a series of moving the home base to allow me wider and wider perspectives. And so what you talk about the gap, you're absolutely right. A very famous Indian guru said one time that all human suffering lies in the gap between the ego and the self. The ego, very self-importantly, thinks it's the center of the psyche, and it is not. It's merely the CEO of waking consciousness. The center of the psyche is the soul, and it is the gap, in the identification, wrongly identifying the self with the ego that creates all human suffering. So when we learn to recognize that gap, we begin to recognize where ego, is messing up the situation. Yeah. Johanna was next.
I have a question about our experience of the electromagnetic spectrum is quite small.
Yeah.
So there's the scientific proof of what we can see and what we can experience, and then there's the more of like not proven but an experiential realm where we can experience that. And then what about like your takes on that, and then the imagination realm of where does that kind of go? It's kind of a universe question almost.
Good. Fabulous. So as I said, I've defined imagination for you many times. We wrongly think of imagination as the ability to make up stuff that's not real. That is not imagination. That's fantasy. Imagination is the ability to volitionally shift my state of consciousness, enter different dimensions, interact with entities and energies that reside in those different dimensions, learn from them, and bring that learning back and cross-fertilize it with this waking state of consciousness. So imagination is the most important faculty that a scientist has, or a mystic has, or a child has. And so when kids talk about imaginary playmates, they're not imaginary in the sense that parents tell them that you're just making that up. They're having real encounters with entities that reside in different dimensions, and they're very important in the evolution of the child's psychology and spirituality. And so the emphasis on imagination is really, really important. Our sensorium can only deliver us a tiny slice. And science, like religion, is a series of stories. Basically, science is the stories we make up about the experiences that we can grok through our sensorium and by extension through our instrumentation. And we make up all these stories about it. I guarantee you in 20 years' time, the notion of the Big Bang will be as laughable as the notion of the Chinese that the world is sitting on the back of a great big turtle. It's our best story at the moment given the data we have. And we're, unfortunately, our cartographers of reality are focused on, data delivered by one state of consciousness, instead of exploring all the states of consciousness, dream states, imagination, mystical states. When we start drawing data from all these states of consciousness, our maps of reality are less imprecise. They're never going to be precise. They're never going to be accurate. They're never going to be total. We will always have less than total, less than accurate maps of reality as long as we're encased in these spacesuits. But they'll be less than accurate if we're drawing our data points from many, many different states of consciousness. Ingrid and then Chris.
Well, I always love that question, what is reality?
Good.
And in metaphysics, you learn there are so many levels of reality, and they all have a truth and potential. I've been lucky to meet some people that I consider masters of matter. And these people go beyond the law of physics. They go into the physics of miracles. And I've seen this with people who use NLP and hypnotherapy and dowsing. And they play with the particle field. They engage with it. And they have fun with it. And they bring the love in it. And they bring the gratitude and the joy in it. And it's amazing what we can do in our own quantum field of these infinite possibilities by bringing these attitudes and excitement and questions of what's possible.
That's brilliant, Ingrid. I mean, if somebody were to ask me, do I believe in miracles? I'd have to ask them a question. What do you mean by miracle? If by miracle you mean that God temporarily sets aside the laws of the universe in order to indulge the prayers of holy people, I would say to you, no, I don't believe in miracles. But by what looks miraculous is not in fact miraculous at all. It is that the universe in which we live, its multi-dimensional universe in which we live, is much, much, much more complex than we've understood. And so the great avatars like you're talking about, or the Jesus Christ, they understood the laws of the universe at such a depth that they were able to behave and work with these laws in ways that look miraculous to us, but they're not miraculous. If you went to a desert island to a very, very primitive tribe who were still Stone Age people, and you brought an iPhone, you look like a magician to them. But all you're doing is you've understood the electromagnetic spectrum in a way that they yet haven't understood. So when we get to understand the universe at the level at which the Jesus Christ have understood the universe, then miraculous things happen. But they're not miracles, they're simply how the universe has been constituted. Chris.
Yeah, this is really an interesting subject. I just have, personally, I just have a really difficult problem with the concept of free will. I've done thousands of hours of workshops, various therapies and all this stuff, and spent a lot of money on it. And I'm still the same person. And the object of all this was to get some free will.
Okay.
And I just see myself as an absolute total robot. I have no free will at all. And I'm manipulated every day of my life by my programming. And probably the bottom line of my programming is a self-destructive program that I've had for a long, long time, and I can't break out of that. Once I really discovered that self-destructive programming, I could see it to some degree in everybody else. And we all seem to be the same people day after day, year after year, and decade after decade. We change a little here and there, but basically the same people, and we just don't seem to be able to break out of that programming. And it's great cocktail conversation to talk about, what we would do with free will and so forth, but I don't think we have any. And Paramahansa Yogananda made the comment that basically in the lower realms, we don't have any free will. It's only in the higher realms, when we're more awake, that we actually can make choices. So I'm just really burnt out on being a robot. So I'm just wondering if you have any gems to offer on that.
I'm Irish, I always have a response. The first stage of freedom, Chris, is realizing you're in prison. The first stage of freedom is realizing you're in prison. And you've realized that. So that's the beginning of your freedom. That's the beginning of the exercise of free will. There's a great story about the Israelites were spent 430 years in servitude as slaves in Egypt between about 1750 BC and 1250 BC. And then along came this liberator called Moses, and he took them out into the desert. And they were promised this new land flowing with milk and honey. And according to the scriptures, it took them 40 years to arrive there, but actually didn't. If you read through the scriptures, they arrived at the promised land within 6 weeks. And they sent spies in to reconnoiter the land, and these guys came back and said, we can't conquer this land. The people in this land are like giants. We look like grasshoppers in their sight. They'll eat us up. So they went back into the desert, and they spent 40 years wandering in the desert until that entire generation had died out. So the first group were given physical freedom, but they were psychologically enslaved. So until a group came in that was psychologically free, they couldn't conquer the promised land. So the first stage of freedom is the realization I'm in prison. That's a hugely important place. There are millions and millions and millions of people out there who are in the same prison as you and I, but they don't know they're in prison. So they're doubly, shackled. You're not shackled because you know that you're in a prison. And the prison has been created by the expectation and the cultural artifacts of our evolutionary history as human beings. But if you actually look at that history over a long enough time span, there is movement and there is freedom. There's a great book written by a Harvard scholar called Stephen Pinkard called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And it traces human warfare and human violence over a 5,000-year period. And the fact of the matter is, there's a very, 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 very significant decline in violence, international violence, one-on-one violence, or violence towards animals. The problem with us is that we live like a 50, 60, 70-year span, and when you look at the trajectory of human evolution, it's actually going a little bit like this. And if you take your starting point and your end point, it's climbing. But if you take any one segment, there may be a downturn. So, for instance, if you were to take this graph between 1939 and 1945, it would look like we were going to hell in a handbasket with World War II. You take the overall trajectory, however, and there is definitely an improvement in freedoms and a lessening in violence. So the fact that you're awake to the realization that we're still shackled by society and by political systems and economic models, that already sets you free in some sense. And then the realization that we have to look at a long-term trajectory to find out, are we actually improving as a species? We are. It's painfully slow, but we are.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but the problem is I'm a little impatient. I don't want to wait 50 lifetimes before I really get to
I got it. That's why God created reincarnation. And that's why God said there is no such thing as time, Chris. You're locked into time. Get out of time already. Time does not exist.
Well, I'm still patient, but I'll take that up to God.
Okay. Catherine. Sorry. Cesar.
My question is about the subconscious, and my understanding is that it influences my thoughts, my feelings, and my actions, yet I'm not aware of it.
Yes.
So it makes me, what is the connection between that and free will?
Okay, brilliant. That's a brilliant question. And so there's, depending on whether you're reading, Freud or Jung or whatever, there are different versions of the unconscious. So the Jungian model is the one that makes most sense to me, that there are at least two levels. There's the personal unconscious and there's the collective unconscious. So the collective unconscious is people with the archetypes of the evolutionary process of the entire species, whereas the personal one is based upon encounters and relationships I've had during a particular incarnation. But of course, a lot of programming, this is exactly what Chris is saying. There's a whole bunch of programming that happens from the moment, a child is conceived. Not even before they're born. There's programming happening already inside the child. So there are ground rules being laid down. And the difficulty is that for the first 5 or 6 years, a child believes everything is told to be actual, factual reality, not as an opinion, not as a kind of a consideration, but as an opinion. So it's like we're laying down these rules in concrete, in wet cement, that then concretizes over. And it becomes the place from which a lot of our emotional reactions to life are driven. And then that's also aided and abetted by the fact that we have a genetic ancestry going back 3.7 billion years from the very first single-celled creatures that inhabited planet Earth. And we carry all that genetic material with us as well. Now, the object of the exercise is to bring as much of that to consciousness as possible. Now, Carl Jung says that, speaking of the unconscious, the personal unconscious particularly, and particularly the shadow, Jung said, is 80% gold. It is 80% unrealized potential, and it is 20% repressed material. So when you dive into the unconscious, you're not just swimming with the bottom feeders in the muck, you're also beginning to realize the potential you have that you never realized in the incarnation. So it becomes really, really important with some kind of guidance and a lot of care to frequently visit the personal and the archetypal unconscious in order to kind of harvest the abilities resident. But they hugely influence our actions. And the whole notion of awareness is that we bring all of that to full consciousness. So we're aware of why we're doing what we're doing or what we're saying. Yeah, great point, Chris. We'll take one more, guys. It's 10 to 11. So Catherine had her hand up first. Catherine.
Thank you. Is free will really just an illusion, though? I mean, because isn't it all karma that we're working out? And so do we really have a choice in what we're doing? I'm not really sure.
So my opinion is we have lots of choices. We have the choice, the first choice is to stay asleep or to wake up. That's the most important choice of all. Yeah, I'm serious. And the only sin, I'm convinced, sin is not the transgression of precept or the breaking of a commandment. That's not a sin. That's a tertiary consequence. The only sin is the decision to stay asleep. It's the only sin. And so the first choice is, am I going to stay asleep or am I going to wake up? If I choose to wake up, I have to start radically examining the cosmologies in which I was marinated by society. And that's looking at the political system, economic models, religious belief systems, all of these things. And do I really believe these anymore? Do they make sense to me anymore? And to begin to discard that which does not make sense or that which kind of keeps me in thrall. And at that, as I open up more and more freedoms are possible to me. Even if I'm shut down by society and locked in prison and put in solitary confinement, if I'm really awake, solitary confinement is not an imprisonment. It's just an ability to hang out with my soul and safari in a different kind of space. So there is total freedom available once we start waking up. Guys, we got to stop there. We've got a community meeting immediately after Mass. Thank you for your patience. So before we continue with our Eucharist, let's offer each other a sign of our peace.